Hello, Jake Lloyd Bacon here to tell you a little about my podcast, Elaborate. It's not super high concept, it's a talk show in which I sit down with artists, actors, comedians, writers, and more from all walks of life and simply connect. I'm exploring the human condition. I'm trying to figure out why we are, who we are, and how the hell we got here. It's a conversation, it's an interview, it's not therapy, but it is therapeutic. So join me and my guests on Elaborate, available at elaboratepod.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation. We are so glad to have you here and so glad to welcome our guest for this episode. But before we do that and get the conversation started, I just want to share a little news with you. First off, I want to congratulate Clare Davies as the winner of our inaugural meme contest. Claire, we will be contacting you with information about how to claim your prize from our Don't Quill the Messenger swag shop. And the rest of you, watch for the meme entries to start appearing on our Facebook page over the next week or so, now that they have been curated and judged. And thank you to all of you who sent us an entry. They're a lot of fun, as you will all soon see by following our Facebook page and checking them out. You can also always send us more. The contest entry deadline is over, but we love to receive memes. So go ahead and do that. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Send us your memes. They're clever, they're fun, and we like them. And they help spread the message in wonderful new ways. Just a quick update about the Quiller gathering we are planning for next April. We have now selected our dates. Put them on your calendar. The event will take place Thursday, April 11th through Sunday, April 14th, 2024, with the major event occurring on Friday, April 12th, the 474th birthday of Edward de Vere. It is going to be a fantastic marathon weekend celebration filled with presentations, performances, social gatherings, and fantastic theatrical offerings you won't want to miss. As we record this very episode, we are currently securing the final details with the presentation and performance venue, the hotel, and the caterers. What I can tell you is that the event will feature a theme of Shakespeare and the law. It will include presentations and performances surrounding The Merchant of Venice, Henry VI Part 2, and The Gravediggers from Hamlet. The headline event will be a full performance of Shakespeare's Treason, written by Hank Whittemore and Ted Story, and performed by yours truly. Watch for more details to come in just the next couple of weeks, and then registration will soon open and be available. You can't imagine our excitement here at Don't Quill the Messenger. This is going to be the greatest Shakespeare authorship mystery event ever. April 11th through the 14th, 2024. Save the dates and watch for more to come. If you do want to stay completely up to date about all things Quiller in nature, be sure to get on our email newsletter subscriber list by sending me an email, and I'll add you to the list. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. The growth of this Quiller Nation is incredible. What we will soon be able to accomplish together is astounding. Thank you, Quiller Nation. I'm so proud to be a part of this movement with you. My guest for this exciting episode is not a Shakespeare authorship skeptic, but she is a Shakespeare historian. Cassidy Cash is also a historical map illustrator, and we'll be asking her a little bit about that because I don't know that I've ever met one of those before. And she's the host of That Shakespeare Life, the podcast that interviews expert historians to explore the people, events, and objects that were living or happening in Shakespeare's lifetime. That Shakespeare Life is currently ranked the number 2 Shakespeare history podcast in the world. I would be lying if I didn't admit I'm a little bit jealous of that ranking. In addition to podcasting, Cassidy creates independent films about the 16th and 17th century. Her documentary short films and animated films about Shakespeare's history have won international film awards for both history and animation. She is a member of the National Council on Public History, the American Historical Association, the Renaissance Society of America, the English Playing Cards Society. We'll be asking about that as well. And the Shakespeare Association of America. Her work has been published in multiple academic journals and on major history platforms, including History Magazine, History Hit, and our favorite, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Connect with Cassidy and explore life in the 16th and 17th centuries of England and the English Renaissance, the way Shakespeare might have lived it, by visiting her website at CassidyCash.com. That's Cassidy with 2 S's, CassidyCash.com, CassidyCash.com. Cassidy, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
You know, one of the things that I really want to talk to you about and that I hope you'll share with our listeners is sort of your personal journey as a fellow Shakespeare-phile, a lover and an enthusiast of the works and that time period and the history that led to you forming your podcast. But where did it all begin for you? Was it in school? Was it a particular English literature professor? I mean, all of us sort of have this is how I discovered and fell in love with Shakespeare story, and I would really love to hear yours.
How I discovered and fell in love with Shakespeare's story happened when I was quite young. My grandparents used to go and visit my great-grandmother in a rural part of Alabama where I live, and I would go with them. And when we would visit, my great-grandmother didn't own very many things at all, and she had only 3 books. She had a Bible, a hymnal, and a copy of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And when they would send me off to go play, these were the things to go play with, would be these 3 books. And I picked up the copy of Romeo and Juliet because I wondered, what is this book? If you're only going to have 3, what was so important about this one, that this was the book that she had? So I took it and I read it and I loved it. I mean, I remember as a child not understanding all of it, but I liked that it rhymed. And growing up, reading was always difficult for me anyway, especially long books. It was hard for me to do. Visually, seeing the letters was difficult. And when I read Shakespeare and I read Romeo and Juliet, it was shorter and they rhymed. And so you moved through the dialogue a lot quicker than if you were reading, Jane Eyre or something, which is also one of my favorite books. But it was easier to get through for me. Even when I didn't understand everything, I found myself laughing at the jokes and thinking the insults were funny. And Mercutio especially was just always getting up in a tizzy about stuff. And I thought that he was hilarious. And so it was just very, very fun. And no one told me that it was a play instead of a book. And so I came home thinking, a book that I like, a book I can read. I was thrilled. So I asked my mom, I came home saying, Mom, are there more books by this Shakespeare guy? Did he make more? And so she went and got me a biography about William Shakespeare so that I could learn more. And I remember going through it and it was full of archival information and like pictures of Shakespeare's home and items from the 16th and 17th century. And I just was grateful to Shakespeare for writing something that was accessible to me. And so I fell in love with learning more about him and I just wanted to know everything I could. And that's really how it all blossomed from there.
I guess we're lucky you didn't turn into like a Sunday preacher or something, since your only materials were either a Bible, a hymnal, or Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it really could have gone the other way, couldn't it? You could have a whole podcast on religious studies instead.
I could have, I guess. I mean, I'm a Christian, so I have a background I was raised in the church. So I guess I felt like I knew a lot about the Bible, and I had sung all the songs in the hymnals. So the third book was the only one on the shelf I didn't know that much about. So I guess that's why that happened.
So tell us how you become the host of this super popular podcast that is known throughout the world for you have like 200 and something. You almost have 300 episodes now. You've been doing this for quite some time. And tell us how that all began and where that started in your journey as a podcaster.
Absolutely. I was getting my master's degree in information engineering. I was working in marketing as a graphic designer and just a marketing professional for small and large companies on a freelance basis. And I thought I was going to expand my career as a marketer. And so I was getting my master's degree in information engineering to get better at what I did. And part of an assignment during this master's degree program was to do, it was a simulation, I guess. And they asked if you could do anything you wanted to do, what would you, and you didn't, if you could do anything, what would you be excited to get up and do every day? And don't worry about, how you're going to make money. Don't worry about whether or not it's going to work. Just what would you be excited about? If you knew tomorrow you're going to get up and this is what your task is for the day, what would you be thrilled to do? And my honest answer was, I would really love to get up in the morning and not have to get dressed and go to an office, but instead fix a nice cup of tea and be able to sit down across the table and talk with some of the people who know the most there is to know about William Shakespeare and life in the 16th and 17th century. And I want to just have a conversation with them about that. And that was what I wanted to do. And so we met with our mastermind group there as part of the assignment. And they said, okay, follow this simulation out. What would it look like to build a business around that idea? And I thought that I was going to start a blog because, of course, that was the easy, accessible thing to me. I thought, okay, well, I'll just start a blog and I'll write about Shakespeare history. But I wrote up my first blog post and I shared it with the team and got the review back from them. And they said, Cassidy, please don't start a blog. I said, why? And they said, you can't write. You're a horrible writer.
Oh, no. Like, that's terrible.
This is full of great. No, it was awful. They came back and they said, no, you can't write at all. And I said, you got to be kidding. And they said, no, but let me tell you, have you ever thought about starting a podcast? And I said, what's a podcast? And they looked back at me and they said, that I was really animated when I would talk with people. If I was telling you about Shakespeare history, I'd get really into it and really enthusiastic. And this was a team of engineers, right? And they said, their feedback to me was, normally we would hate Shakespeare, but when you talk about it, we get so into it because you're so into it. You got to do this on a podcast. And I had no idea what a podcast was. So I went looking and I got plugged in with a podcast coach. And what he does professionally is train people how to podcast. And so I signed up with him and we spent about a year on the back end. We spent 6 months building the show and setting it all up, getting the preliminary episodes put together. And he taught me the business of running a podcast and the professionalism of what a podcast is supposed to look like. And then we launched it and they walked me through then the launch process as well. So I had a team, I had a mastermind group behind me for the first 3 years of the show where we were doing behind the scene things to build it and do the professional part. But they were right. It worked really well. I could share my enthusiasm and I got to do exactly what I had said I wanted to build a business around, which was getting to, have my cup of tea and talk with the world's leading experts on this piece of history. And so that's how the podcast came to be.
So are you drinking a cup of tea right now?
Of course. No, actually, I have water with me right now, but it would normally be tea. Yes.
And let me guess, is it English Earl Grey? Is that your favorite?
No, actually, I gave up caffeine. When it started, it was all about coffee. So to be truthful, in the mastermind group, I wanted to fix a cup of coffee, but I've since given up caffeine, and so now it's actually chamomile tea is my go-to.
Okay, very good. just had to know those little details.
Of course, I mean, I got to get the whole picture.
So let me ask you a question, because I'm curious about this. Do you remember, obviously, having that professional support behind you in building the podcast and getting prepared for launch? Do you remember what it was like to launch that first episode and lining up those first few guests? And tell us a little bit about the earliest
absolutely.
parts of it as opposed to where it is now.
Oh, you're scared to death. I remember holding my breath. It was my friend Philippa Brule at British History Tours did our first ever recording with me, and I'm so grateful to Philippa because I had already been connected with her. So it was a softer ask. I wasn't reaching out to a complete stranger. I was reaching out to someone that I had been a little bit connected with before, and she came on and talked about something she knew a whole lot about. We talked about, I think the very first episode is on Tudor life at court. We were answering the question of, Shakespeare goes to court. What does that mean? Especially for someone here in the U.S., we've no frame of reference for that. So she came on and talked to us about what going to court meant, and it was I held my breath even then, sending that email. And as far as differences go, back in the beginning, I was nobody. Nobody had heard of my show. Nobody had heard of anything I was doing. I had no street cred whatsoever, and I was just as good as spam showing up in people's inboxes. And so I would have to send, it was 100 emails a week to get one guest. And I remember my task for the day would be send 25 pitch emails today. And I would do that every single day to get the guests because people didn't know me. And so I had to find these people that were willing to take a chance on me and to take a chance on the show and to appear on the show with us. And that has lessened. I still do have to send several emails to coordinate the guests, but it's not 25 a day anymore. It's much less. We were sending hundreds and hundreds of emails in the beginning, just to be but I was following the templates that Jeff Brown, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to him. You can find him at Read to Lead podcast. He still coaches podcasters if you're looking to start one, but he was helping me behind the scenes. I remember I would ask Jeff, how do I write a pitch email? What does a pitch email need to have in it? How do I sound professional when I don't have this built yet? I am actively building it. What does that look like? And they would, the whole team would walk through it with me, and I would test the pitch email on them, and they would tell me, okay, this is what that, change this, don't say that. Never apologize. Don't make excuses. You're a professional. This is what they would tell me. And so I would build it and send it out. And I just acted on the trust that they had in me at the beginning. I acted on faith of, I have these experts telling me that this will work. I'm going to do the system they're telling me will work. And it did. It worked exactly like they said it would. But I was just following instructions on the back end because until I got connected with Jeff, I didn't even know what a podcast was. So I was totally following instructions for the first few years.
That's an incredible story. And when I look at the volume of library that you now have created, the number of episodes that you have, it makes me think back on some of my earliest episodes. And I know that I feel like some of them weren't actually the best. And when new people find the podcast, they tend to go back to the beginning and start at the beginning. And I like to think, well, I hope they'll make it through some of those earlier ones and get to the better ones and remain a regular listener and not listen to the first few and go, oh, this sucks, and move on to something else. There's so much content out there. Do you ever have that concern about some of your earlier work?
Well, I will say one of the reasons we put so much time into building it before it was live was to mitigate some of that. The people in my mastermind group were seasoned podcasters, and they had done this for a long, long time. And that was one of the common issues that they wanted to help my podcast not have. But I will say every podcaster's first episodes are not as good as their current episodes because you just learn so much and you add and you iterate. And every time you do it, you're learning and you're growing. So absolutely, there's a huge difference in We follow the same format, I will say. I have it's basically a template outline called the parts of a podcast, and our episodes have all of those parts in it every time. But definitely there's a difference in the sound and the delivery, and you can tell I was new. But no, I'm not. I don't have any episodes of our show that I'm afraid for my listeners to discover, or that I think they'll quit listening to our show if they find them. And that's just due to the prep work we put in before we launched it live, of making sure we're putting out something that is gonna have that longevity.
That's super important. And I forget. You're a new episode every week, right?
Every week, every Monday, we have a new show. Yes.
Yeah. So you're doing twice as many episodes per year as I'm currently doing. And I have a hard time handling, sometimes maintaining my schedule every fortnight. And so what is that like for you to have to continue to generate content week after week? And how do you remain inspired, especially after covering so many subjects already in the 250 or so episodes you already have?
Is it? Yes, I ask myself this question sometimes, but it's amazing to me. It's like I'll get to this point where I think, okay, surely we've covered everything. We're gonna run out of stuff here, and then we never do. We never run out of questions to ask. It's like every question that we answer, there's a whole world of history that opens up, and there's more that you can discuss and more that you can learn. And I think between our listeners that write in with their own questions, which inspire a lot of our episodes. We have listeners that write in and say, hey, do you know anybody that can tell me about such and forth? And I'll go, I don't, but I'm going to find somebody and we'll put an episode together for you. And that's how we get some of our topics. Or I'll be talking with a guest and they'll mention something in their answer that's kind of a tangent if we were to address it right there. So we won't chase that rabbit on the episode, but I'll make myself a note that we need to circle back to this. And so I actually have an Excel sheet on my computer where it's called Topics and Pitches. And anytime I have an idea for an episode, I'll write it in my Topics and Pitches show. And then when I go to pitch guests for our next set of episodes, I refer back to my sheet and go, well, what topics did I write down over the last few weeks? What are the some? And I'll pick out the really golden ones and say, yes, we've got to cover this. I prioritize listener requests of, I had a listener that wants to hear about this, so we'll cover that first. And then I go to my list of things that I want to know about, and we'll cover those too. And that's how we generate the topics. And I used to think I was going to run out. I've decided that curiosity is endless, and there's always going to be something else that we can learn or discover about the life and history of William Shakespeare. And so that's where the topics come from. Now, as far as handling the volume, we did that on the front end. We set our show up from day one to be 8 weeks ahead of itself, for the fact that not being overwhelmed with what production was going to look like each week was important to me. I am a stay-at-home mom. I have 2 kids that I homeschool, and I didn't want to take time away from them to have this be my job. So I set a very narrow set of criteria around what my day needed to be and what my day did not need to be. And that was going to include being ahead of myself. I had to have room for the kids to get sick and the episode still goes out, or I have, a disaster happen and the episode needs to still go out. And the way that we managed that was we run our show between 4 and 8 weeks ahead year round. And that does 2 things. It allows the regular drumbeat of my work to be to be steady, to where I'm not having to spend 8 to 10 hours a day ever having to run the show. I'm spending, I will sometimes set aside batch days, especially if we use up some of that buffer and I've got to get in there and batch record stuff and build the buffer back up. I will schedule what's called batch days. And that's where I'll set aside, 4 hours on Friday and 4 hours on Saturday. We're going to crunch through this and do that. But I don't schedule those any more often than like once a month at the most, but I don't do it that often. That's just giving you a frame of reference. But
I totally understand.
Staying ahead of myself.
I miss batch days because I used to have batch days, especially when my producer and I lived closer to each other. Batch days were always awesome because you created that buffer, you created that breather zone.
Yes.
But also it does require setting aside an entire day, which is not ever really easily done, especially with small children. I can relate to that. I have 3. And I'm a part-time stay-at-home dad, so I totally understand.
There you go. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah,
yes,
where it's like
absolutely.
you have to be disciplined. You have to follow a schedule, and I think it's fun that you asked that question, because when you're listening to podcasts, and I definitely want my listeners to have this experience, but it sounds like we sat down, we turned on the mic, and we recorded it, and then we're done. And it's not at all how it works. There's like just a mountain of work behind the scenes that goes into producing a podcast. And I think the only way that I manage it and not get overwhelmed is I have a schedule every week. Each day has a task, and I try not to let, Friday's tasks bleed back into Wednesday. Wednesday gets Wednesday's stuff. And, as the verse says, every day has enough trouble of its own. We keep it to each day, but that's how I do it.
Well, it's super important that you're so passionate about the subject, and I think that certainly helps. And it's funny that you mentioned at the beginning about your engineering colleagues who talked about how contagious that passion is. And I think that that's one of the true reasons for the success of your series is your passion does come through. And the way that you guide your guests into conversation is something that I try to emulate here on my show as well. And I think that shows through. And one of the things I always was taught is that, it should sound just like you say. It should sound like you sat down, turned on the microphone, had a conversation, and the listener just happened to be in the room by accident when the conversation was happening, sort of a feel.
Yes. Now, when it's funny that you say that. This is something specific that Jeff taught me. And when I am teaching, because sometimes I'll take on 3 or 4 podcasters and I teach them how to do Shakespeare podcasting. I did that last year. And this is one of the things that I teach people, but it's because Jeff taught it to me. He said, and when I first started out, he actually had me set a chair where I could see it in my line of sight. And he said, I want you to pretend that your listener is sitting in that chair while you're talking. So don't ignore them. When you're sitting at the table with your guest, it's not just you and the guest, it's you and the guest and your listener. So when I am asking questions, you'll hear me phrase them specifically. All of the you terminology is to the listener. So if I'll say, you'll know that you've heard about this part of history, but Chris, why don't you tell us about what you wrote in your book about this? So all of the you and the direct conversation is to the listener, because I'm very, very conscious of the fact that they are sitting at the table with us. And I want you to feel like when you're listening to our show that you've sat down right next to me and you and I are talking to this expert on Shakespeare history. It's very intentional.
I like that. That's a very important tactic to acknowledge the audience. And another thing I think that, something I learned, I used to be a journalist for a small period of time in my life. And one of the things that my best editors always told me is, write to the listener who knows nothing. Or at that point, yes. It was right to the reader. But, and so sometimes I think we can fall into this trap, especially because we're doing this week after week, of assuming that our audience base has been keeping up and is as informed or has listened to every episode up to this one, and having to sort of ride that line between addressing the listener in the sense of the loyal fan base who's been with you for years and the new listener who has just discovered you and is now kind of trying to catch up and coming along, and making sure that you're not alienating one or the other, and making sure to create an enjoyable and entertaining piece that will hopefully make them come back for the next one.
Exactly. Yeah, you do. That's something that I struggle with too, and that we try to be conscious of, because I want to share in-depth information that is detailed. And I am very adamant about, we're not watering down anything on our show. We're going to share the deep, in-depth, specific history, but we want to be welcoming and accessible to somebody that this is their first time stepping into that kind of history. And we covered this. We just recorded a show on the first folio. And that was one of the things that me and the guest talked about before we started the recording was, well, what would we say to somebody that has never, ever heard about the first folio? What if they don't know anything about where this came from? And they may not even know what folio means. And so we included some content in the episode specifically to help bring them into the conversation of, okay, if you have never heard what this is, let's make sure that you have that before we dive into the other. And yeah, you're right. Exactly. It's this balance of you want to do both.
Tell me about you mentioned that you get inspiration for some of your episodes from your listeners. And I'm constantly asking my listeners to please email me and let me know things that they would like to hear us talk about or guests that they would like me to invite to the show. And so I totally understand that. But tell me a little bit about some of, say, maybe the strangest requests that you received. The open-ended nature of your series with regards to the Elizabethan era and even the Jacobean era, I think, really can go just about anywhere. And so tell me about some of like the craziest or strangest requests you've received or episodes you've done based on those requests that are your favorites.
Let's see. Weird questions. I'm scanning back through to look at some of my episodes. We talked about one of the wildest episodes we've talked about is we talked about Queen Elizabeth's essentially autopsy after she died. And that was, I had never heard this story before, and it was wild and gross. And so that was a crazy episode to have happen. We also talked about mermaids. We've covered the history of mermaids on our show before, which was exciting. And I really liked our episode on Elizabethan dogs. There's a specific dog breed that's related to the dachshund that was called a turnspit dog. And it was actually kept in kitchens to turn the wheel for like roasting a piece of meat. But that was its job, kind of like if you've ever seen a horse or a mule turn the crank to grind wheat. The turnspit dog was in a similar contraption, but only in a kitchen and for turning meat instead of for grinding wheat. And so that exploring all of the different kinds of dog breeds and what they were.
That's incredible because in Much Ado About Nothing, everything lends itself to another reference for me that I just love that, because in Much Ado About Nothing, Benedict has a line where he talks about Beatrice, and he says that she could cause Hercules to turn into a turnspit dog. Hercules himself would turn spit. Yes. Yea, and cleft his club too to make the fire, he says. And so there's that great visual imagery now, and I'm actually directing that show right now. So at tonight's rehearsal, I will go to the actor when he says that line. I'll say, okay, here's some visual for you to imagine in your mind what it is that you're trying to say here that maybe audiences are never going to understand, but the more you understand it, the clearer it's going to be for them to enjoy. And that's fabulous. I love that.
Yeah. And that's where our episodes usually go. We try to say, if you understand the history, then the plays come alive because you know what they're talking about. And you understand that having the life of a turnspit dog would be, to be enslaved to a meaningless, endless, mediocre task. And it was really an insult and a threat for sure. So
no thanks.
Let's see some other fun episodes we did. Yeah. I guess those are some of my favorites. I like the archaeology episodes that we've done where we get to talk with people who have uncovered actual artifacts from Shakespeare's lifetime, especially really fun ones. We talked with the team that discovered Richard III's body. And at the time, the findings hadn't been released yet. So we got to talk to them about, okay, so tell us about his spine. Was it really curved or not? And they were able to answer some of those questions. And so those kinds are also very fun.
That does sound like a very fun episode because, we all see Richard III as this villain, and there's an entire society in England that is dedicated to like trying to change that stigma that has been placed upon him. And I don't think that they'll succeed, but I think Shakespeare's propaganda has destroyed Richard III forever. I don't think there's any way around that. But, the two princes in the tower and all is another one that's going to be real hard for them to get around. But I have seen some stuff where they're out there trying to make him more of a benevolent king in history, which I think is kind of amusing and fun. And that would be an interesting episode.
Yeah. I'm going to personally have trouble with the word benevolent being associated with Richard III, but
Right.
more power to them.
So one of the episodes that I most recently listened to that I really enjoyed, and I'm way behind, obviously, because you have such a vast library of episodes, but one of the ones that I really enjoyed most recently was one where you had a guest talking about the difference between performances of plays that occurred in major theaters like the Globe or the Rose and court performances that appeared in the halls of court or at universities, or for the Queen and her court herself. And I found that to be a fascinating episode because I think that when we think of the plays of Shakespeare, we often don't associate anything further than them being performed at the Globe in front of a large crowd of the public, including the groundlings there on the floor and throwing radishes if they didn't like the players, and that kind of, Renaissance fair experience. And I don't believe that that's very accurate when it comes to many of the works and how they were first introduced to an audience.
Yeah, and that's an important aspect of it. I think they were definitely useful in the Globe formats, but no, as you're saying, that wasn't often the first place that they were witnessed.
That changes a lot of the dynamic of the content of the plays, I think, and who the audience is. Just like we were talking about how we're trying to make sure that we're addressing our audience as if they are in the room with every episode we record. I think that you then have to have a clear understanding of the writer when writing the plays, writing for the audience that he knows is going to be seeing the play. And that therefore helps us understand some of the political messages, some of the underlying jokes, the lampooning of certain members of the court who he knows will be in attendance at that first performance of it, or subsequent performances of it. I think that's a super important aspect to the writing in that sense. Don't you agree?
I would think that it's definitely relevant. Absolutely. And it definitely brings to light, I guess. It gives purpose to what would otherwise just be a flippant insult or a sideways thing. But I think that even the people in the Globe are going to enjoy political references. I think a lot of times I've made the comparison between performances of Shakespeare's plays and stand-up comedy, because it was that kind of political current events commentary in an entertaining venue. Like, the purpose was to make you laugh, but we're also making fun of very, very to the minute events that are going on in England right at that moment. And you are having to take into account, well, I don't want to make these people too angry because then I won't have a job anymore. And so I think editorial cartoons in a newspaper and stand-up comedians are really a good parallel when you're thinking about what made these plays functional. It wasn't just purely for the art form. It was a reflection of what was going on in their lives at the time.
Well, and you want to talk about, we talked today about the idea of cancel culture, but I can't imagine a more severe cancel culture than a totalitarian, a totalitarian state where the Queen can, if she is too offended, say, "You're dead. Goodbye. You're dead." Or I'm going to chop off both of your hands so that you can never write again.
I think Ben Jonson's experience with Isle of Dogs is a great example of where, and the whole function of the Master of the Revels and the place where, you've got this person whose literal job it is to tell you whether or not you can produce this play. I think a modern reference there would be the Hayes office for films, where they would come out and they would say, no, you can't use that word, or you can't have that scene. And there was this oversight committee about what was proper and appropriate to put into film for public consumption. The Masters of the Revels did that for Shakespeare's plays of like, well, no, we're going to review this first because you can't include these things if you're going to present it before the monarchy. That's not acceptable. And it's the same sort of review committee that has to go through and say, well, what can you have and what can you not, before you put it on stage.
Yeah, no more than 2 F-bombs in a movie or you get an R rating, for instance.
It used to be. They've updated that. I remember we were talking about this with, I think my husband and I were discussing this because we were watching the Kingsman movies, and there's just tons of F-bombs in that film. And it was funny to us because I remember we were in high school and it was like we watched some Robert Redford movie and he said an F-bomb, and up to that point we didn't think Robert Redford could say the F-bomb. And so but there was like a limit.
No, not Bob. No.
I know. I was just
it's like
shocked
when Jane
and like,
Seymour
oh my
went
gosh.
topless in whatever that movie was, where she was the like really horny aunt or whatever. And everybody was like, no, this cannot be. Not Dr. Quinn, medicine woman.
I know. It's like your childhood is just shattered right in this one film. But yes, very similar situation.
I wonder if that's because, in Britain, F-bombs don't have the same effect there. Like they throw the F word around a lot differently than we do here. And it has,
There's
somewhat different connotations.
Yeah.
But
and they have a whole slew of curse words and expletives that we don't even have here. Like sometimes I'll be watching a British film and they'll have words in it that I'm like, okay, is that a curse word? What even is that word? So it, there's definitely a different culture around expletives for sure.
So now I want to touch on something that the Quiller Nation, my listener base, will not forgive me if I don't at least ask you this question. And I'm going to phrase it in this way.
All right.
Tell us what you know about the Shakespeare authorship mystery, or what you care to know or not know about it.
Oh, that question feels like a trap.
No, I promise it's not. I just think it's something that I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on it. And I'm just curious about how you feel about it, when you first learned of it, what you learned of it, how you dismissed it, if you dismissed it, where you've allowed yourself to go, if anywhere, with it, whether it even matters to you. Like, just to kind of get a frame of reference for where you come from when it pops up in front of you. It's obviously something that has to pop up here or there on occasion based on 250 something episodes of that time period. And it can't obviously have been completely avoided.
Well, yes, it can have, but only because I was intentional about that. So you asked about 5 questions here, and I'm going to try and address them one at a time. I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with, you asked me what I know about the Shakespeare authorship question. So here's what I understand that to be. When people use the authorship question phrase, they're referring to the difference between 2 schools of thought on Shakespeare. One camp are those like myself who believe William Shakespeare was a real person. He was from Stratford-upon-Avon, England, and that the plays attributed to him were actually written by him. It's not a pen name or some of these other theories. The vast majority of scholars, and certainly among accredited scholars in the realm of Shakespeare, will fall into this camp. The second school of thought is a small group, but very loud group called anti-Stratfordians. And that's a collective term for a broad number of essentially alternative theories around the idea that someone else might have been behind the name William Shakespeare as a pen name or nom de guerre, as it were. While many adherents to the anti-Stratfordian position on the authorship question will claim that controversy existed in the 17th century concerning Shakespeare's personal identity, the traditional starting point for this conspiracy began with a man named Joseph C. Hart in the 19th century. In 1848, he published a book called The Romance of Yachting, and it's a weird book, but it does contain a section on defining nautical terms and various sea-related phrases. So he dedicates about 50 pages inside this nautical term book to a discussion on the authenticity of Shakespeare's plays. It was published in the Bibliography of the Bacon Shakespeare Literature and is most famous for Hart's claim that Shakespeare's plays contained evidence that many different authors had worked on the plays we call Shakespeare's plays. And actually, at this juncture, I will grant Hart that he was right about that observation. There's been many studies since then that have suggested it was industry standard in the early modern period for playwrights to work collaboratively, for one person to pick up another person's work and add to it, or for them to work together on a particular play. We know that several of Shakespeare's plays were written with other authors in addition to Shakespeare as well. So the fact that he could see several authors in that work is actually an accurate description. Where I personally deviate from this is to go from, hey, this play had more than one person working on it, to Shakespeare wasn't a real person at all. To me, that conclusion is based on facts, not in evidence, and is entirely too large of a leap to just go from one to the other. So that's what I know about the Shakespeare authorship question. For
That's
me
very
personally,
fair.
you asked me.
I appreciate your candidness on that, and I think that's very fair. I would then follow. I know I asked like 5 different questions because I wanted to give you a variety of ways to answer so that you didn't feel pinned down. I wasn't
to
trying
approach
to,
it. I see. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to pin you against the wall, and that's why I kind of phrased it the way I did, was to just kind of figure out how you wanted to respond. One of the things that I pride myself here on the program is we treat all guests as guests, and there's never an adversarial relationship between me and my guests. That would be not entertaining. At least I don't think so. I think this is much more fun and more entertaining. But as a follow-up then, because one of the things I had on my list here was I wanted to know your ideas about any known or suspected collaborators and how you felt about that aspect. And you sort of touched on that. So could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
On which part? You want me to give some examples of Shakespeare collaborating?
Yeah. So it sounds to me like you agree that, as you said, that Hart was astute in noticing that there were other hands involved, and that you concede that there may have been other hands involved in certain works. And I'm just curious, like, how much you have looked into that, or what you believe with regards to that. Do you believe that John Lilly was involved, Anthony Munday was involved, Fletcher, like anything in that realm that you can pinpoint or connect to and go, yeah, that's definitely Fletcher in that play, or, that type of a system?
Personally, I have not done individual research into this, but I have had guests on the show. Specifically, I will point you to an episode with Darren Freeberry Jones. And I can give you the direct link to this because Darren's been a guest on our show a couple of times, and I don't remember the number right off, but he did. He's done an episode with us on Robert Greene. He's also done an episode with us on Thomas Kidd. And those are some of the questions that we look at and ask. And they've done, Darren's work looked at bringing, he had a computer system that he brought in that analyzed the text, and he could assign a textual signature to a particular author and sort of evaluate which portions of printed works were written, what percentage of them were written by this author and what percentage of them were written by that author. And it's very, very detailed. And he has data on, Shakespeare worked with this author on this play and this author on that play. I want to say George Peele was one of the ones, and I'm sorry, I don't have more detail than that. But like I said, I can link you to the episodes where Darren's work has details on that. And I defer to them. Their work says it'll show that Shakespeare collaborated with another author on, Shakespeare wrote this part, but then somebody else wrote this other part. Kind of like the way Beaumont and Fletcher worked together. There are several plays we probably should say Shakespeare and someone in terms of having written it with someone else. I think that would be fair.
And I think that modern orthodoxy is starting to lean more and more that way as we're able to, decipher more clearly the different styles that we can see in some of the works. I know that there are a lot of people right now who are diving, and I mean deep diving into AI and asking AI to do these types of stylometric analyses of the different plays and poems. And I'm very curious. I'm watching very closely to see what's happening with that and how the system is sort of educating and learning itself about all there is that's out there. And it's incredible, of course, because it can do in microseconds what it takes most people, decades to complete. And so I'm be curious to see how that all plays out. But I'm glad to know that you have had guests who have touched on this topic, and that you have been open to the idea that it's very possible that there was at least some sort of cabal of writers that got together every once in a while and said, hey, I'm working on this. Can you help me with that? Or, hey, I need a new play. Do you got any ideas? And I think that makes a lot more sense because that's how modern Hollywood works. Writers sit in a room together.
I'll go one step further than that for you. I think it's considered accepted knowledge that it was industry standard for playwrights to collaborate in the early modern period. I don't think that is, to my knowledge, I haven't heard anyone come on our show and suggest that was a surprise. I think it was considered the professional way to behave, that you weren't just sitting in a vacuum writing a play. And you can see that from how many different plays Shakespeare pulls from in his works. And, he's referring to works by Ovid, and he's referring to works by Aeneid, and he's referring to all of these printed works and plays, and he even comments on some current works within his plays. So I think to work in a company, as Shakespeare did, that he wasn't the only writer, and he definitely would work in collaboration with other people. And I think that's accepted, an accepted perspective. I think where it gets the line gets drawn in the sand there is when you cross over from saying this author collaborating with other people means that he wasn't real. It would be like saying because Spielberg worked with George Lucas, well, Spielberg's not a real guy. That's a pen name. That's too far. You can't take that. There's not enough evidence to take that step in my mind. Now, that's not to say I don't appreciate the asking of the question, because I would like to say I think it's good to question what you think you know. And I think it's good to look at history and say, well, we've accepted this theory for 400 years, but are we right? Should we re-examine that? I think I'm definitely glad someone decided to re-examine bloodletting, which was once like the scientific standard for how to treat
leeches,
somebody.
Maybe leeches was a good one too.
Exactly. I think, yes, asking these questions of, is this how we should keep doing this is always a good question to ask. And I think it's a respectful, professional question to ask. I think for me personally, I haven't seen enough evidence to suggest that Shakespeare wasn't real or that he didn't write the plays we think he did. And that's just because my work, I see tons of biographical evidence for William Shakespeare. So I'm open to the idea that at some point some evidence will be put forward that might change my mind. But up to now, I haven't seen it.
Well, the smoking gun, of course, is something
everybody
has been looking for, right? And unfortunately,
exactly.
There's no smoking gun that ties William Shakespeare of Stratford. And I don't think anyone is saying that William Shakespeare of Stratford didn't exist. I think there's plenty of evidence that he existed. I think the big problem is that we don't find any evidence that he was a man of literature and a literary persona in the time period. And I think that's the big issue here, is that everybody goes, okay, well, where are his letters? Where are his books? Where is his library? How come no one has a letter from him that we've never been able to find that he wrote to someone? Not even a letter to his daughter or to his doctor or to anybody, And I think that's the big mystery for a lot of us, well, what happened to what should have been a voluminous amount of paper that this man must have had to create as he was also writing these plays? Did he write to any printers? Did any printers write back and say, your play is trash, I'm not printing it? As many book writers get those types of letters all the time when they send them off to publishers hoping to pick up a book agent or a publisher, that type of a thing. But I do think you're right about the collaboration aspect being a standard of the time. And I think that we see that in modern times as well. There's a writer's strike going on in Hollywood right now. And a lot of those writers work in groups together. The reason why all of the late night entertainment shows have gone off the air during the strike is because they have a team of writers who help write that stand-up monologue that you were talking about. You make that comparison of stand-up comedy. And it's not happening right now because of that. I wonder what might have happened if the writers in Shakespeare's time had all gone on strike, and what might have been the response at that time.
Well, there are documents that Shakespeare that are non-play written documents. Like there's a court case where he was called as a witness against in a case involving the Mountjoys, where one Mountjoy thought he was owed a dowry and the other person didn't, and Shakespeare had witnessed the argument, and he was called in there on a court case, and what he said in the court case is documented, like the minutes there, and that's a surviving document that we have. So that's just one example of archival evidence that's not related to plays he wrote that demonstrates he was a real person. Now, obviously, you can ask the question, well, you can look at Shakespeare's plays and see there's 4,000 people named Henry. How do we know that this William Shakespeare that was in this court case is the same William Shakespeare that wrote these plays? And I think, well, I guess you don't. Ultimately, you can't know with certainty. But I think at that point, I point to the quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, where he says, "For those with faith, no evidence is necessary. And for those without it, no evidence will suffice." And that's kind of where you're at. You got to choose which camp you're going to be in at some point because, if you think he was the guy from Stratford and that he wrote the plays, you're going to see that in the evidence that you're looking at. If you think he wasn't and you're looking for proof that he wasn't, you're going to see that in the evidence that you're looking at. So you're not going to be able to approach any archival evidence completely without bias. And there will come junctures where you have to say, okay, you can interpret this data one of two ways. Where do I want to stand on it? And that's what you have to do. Ultimately.
I think that's a very fair answer, and I appreciate you being willing to address it at all. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for having agreed to come on this program that obviously know is all about this mystery and trying to solve the mystery from our perspective of those who believe that the mystery exists. So I appreciate that. And I thank you for that. I want to shift gears from that then. And I want to get back to the things that we absolutely have in common, which is a love for the plays. And I'm just curious, which tend to be some of your favorites?
Romeo and Juliet is my favorite, obviously, because it's the first one that I found. I never get tired of seeing it performed. I cry every time, and it doesn't matter. I know that story inside and out, and I still cry at the end of that play. I will say, having a 14-year-old son, that play hits different when you watch it as someone who is in the parenting role of someone the ages of the kids involved. I also really love Macbeth. It's one of my favorites, and The Tempest, as well as Twelfth Night. I think those are my top four.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting. I love that you talk about how your opinions of certain works change as you get older or as your circumstances change, especially as a parent. I just saw a story recently where someone wrote about the movie Dirty Dancing, and the person, I don't know what age range you're in, but I remember when that movie first came out and how much we loved it. And I was in my late teens at the time. And now that, it's this many years later, looking back on it, you go, well, wait a minute. Baby's dad was right on the money. Who is going to let their 18-year-old daughter run around with a guy who looks like he's 40, who is a dance instructor at a resort and hanging out and partying and drinking? Right? And it's like, wait a minute, this isn't romantic anymore. This is kind of creepy. It totally does change as you get older.
I know. Yeah, when you're having to worry about protecting your children from pedophiles suddenly jumping on the back of a guy's motorcycle seems like less of a wise decision. Yes, exactly. But, yeah.
Exactly right. And I can only imagine, one of the things that I love about Romeo and Juliet is I believe that the universal human truth of the way teenage boys interact with each other and the jokes that they tell each other and the way that they jab and poke at each other verbally has not changed and probably never will. And
not at all. Yes. Yeah.
And I think that that's part of the beauty of the play are those scenes between Mercutio and Romeo and Benvolio and all of that banter, the whole thing about, the geese and the stuffing of the geese, which today, if we put that into modern terms and we heard our teenagers, I don't have teenagers yet, but I teach teenagers. If we heard them having those types of conversations, we would immediately cease that and tell them that that's inappropriate talk and they shouldn't talk that way with each other.
It's fun. I think one of the things I like about Shakespeare's plays is that you can look back and see that humans are still humans. 400 years ago, they're the same. They have the same base struggles and emotions and responses to things that we have today. And one of the fun things about Romeo and Juliet is I found out that the ages that they was the typical age for getting married. So they weren't actually running off and being rebellious teenagers as much as I have that reaction to it today, because certainly that's not an appropriate age. And for my children, I'd be freaking out. Like, you're not old enough to make these choices. But for their time period, they were old enough to be making those choices. They were just still very young. And so when you see them making youthful, rash decisions, it's the same youthful rash that my 14-year-old would make, but society doesn't expect my son to be an adult right now, and their society would have.
That's exactly true. I point that out whenever I'm directing the show or teaching the show. I point that out. And if you listen to the text, it's very clear. Lady Capulet says that she was not much older than Juliet when she gave birth to Juliet. Well, then that places Lady Capulet, even though so many actresses who have played Lady Capulet have been in their late 30s and 40s. Lady Capulet's probably about 28 years old, according to the text.
Right, mid-20s.
She says that Juliet is almost 14 and that she wasn't much older than that when she gave birth to her. That puts her at 28 years old. She's a very young mother. And, one of the things about that society was they were terrified that their young daughters would lose their virginity prior to marriage. So they married them off as soon as they were of breeding age in order to secure their dowries and to secure the political positions that they were trying to manipulate through those marriages, and to protect them from some young servant boy who suddenly got too enamored with them or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Although the phrase "of breeding age" really kind of makes me cringe and my skin crawl. I'm like,
certainly, but that was their mindset. When you're talking about the 15th and 16th century, you look at Lord Capulet, who basically makes it very clear that Juliet is a possession. She is chattels. And he tells her that if she disagrees with him, he will throw her out on the street and she can become a beggar and die on the street, which is fully within his right. If you look at Midsummer Night's Dream, and Aegeus shows up and declares, if she won't marry who I want her to marry, then Hermia will die. I will kill her under the right of the law. In Much Ado About Nothing, Leonardo attacks Hero once she's been denounced in front of everyone at the church. He tries to murder her and they have to stop him and hold him back. He would have been within the law and within his rights to do so if they don't hold him back and stop him from doing so. I think that sort of historical context is important for us to understand what the characters are doing and what's happening in the moment and in the play.
I agree.
Speaking about that, so, when you have these episodes where you dive into that type of history and that type of societal belief structure at the time, but also the major players of the day. One of the final things that I wanted to touch on with you is if you could share with us some of the people you find that are the most intriguing during that Elizabethan and Jacobean age of that Shakespeare lifetime. Who are some of the characters, the major historical figures that you have learned more about through your series that you think really, hold the power of the time period?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I'm not sure I've been asked that one before, and I've been asked a lot of questions. Let's see. The historical figure that I know more about now. I know a lot more about the pirates and privateers than I would have without the podcast. People like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake and the exploration of the American colonies, which was fascinating to me and something I paid more attention to, I think, because I am from the US. And so that journey over here was particularly interesting to me. John Rolfe and the story of Pocahontas, and how, she actually came back to London and had a son here, or I say son here. My brain lives in London, but
good for you.
Those are characters that I know. I know it's a good city, but yeah, I mean, I think those are characters I know a lot more about. Elizabeth I dominated the culture during Shakespeare's lifetime, and I think a lot of what was true and in existence for his society and culture was dictated by her. So she's you asked about which one was the most powerful force. I think her definitely defining character. The whole of Shakespeare, the whole of 16th century culture would have been different if she wasn't the queen. So I guess we could track back and give Anne Boleyn credit for that as well. But yes, those are some characters that I enjoy learning about and learning more about and wouldn't know as much about without the podcast.
So, well, obviously Elizabeth, we call it the Elizabethan era because of her, and that makes total sense. But what about members of her immediate court or those courtiers that she took a fancy for or that she was rumored to have had romantic relationships with? How much do you think that played a part in the society of her day and age? And who are some of those characters or players that you would point to and say, okay, well, this obviously was an important person,
sure.
an important moment?
Well, you can't not mention Robert Cecil or Francis Walsingham. And I think the story about Lettice Knollys is fascinating. And we've covered that on the show too. And just that whole culture of I don't understand how the woman spent like decades with this will she, won't she, get married or not get married situation, and just kept the whole nation in this, limbo of, is she going to get married? Is she not going to get married? And courting all of these people. I love the story. Let me see if I can pull this up and tell you it correctly here. But at Kenilworth Castle, the story of wooing Queen Elizabeth with this elaborate party. And when Dudley, it was, I found my dates so I can tell you this correctly. In 1575, Robert Dudley used an elaborate theatrical display to woo and propose to Elizabeth I. And I think this whole story should be turned into a play, because every time I read through or learn about this story, I'm rooting for Dudley, right? And you get the impression that Elizabeth was in love with him and he wanted to marry her, and then it all ends with her ultimately saying no and turning him down. And it's the same kind of tragedy that you have at the end of Romeo and Juliet, because you just think they're perfect. This should work. And then it doesn't. And then she goes on to like carry his picture with her for the rest of her life. And it's just a very beautiful, tragic love story. So I think that I don't know what kind of impact on Shakespeare personally that would have, other than the fact that some people do say that William Shakespeare might have been exposed to the display at Kenilworth Castle, because he would have been 11 when this happened, and the fireworks were huge, and it would have been this big to-do. So people from miles around would have traveled to see this display. It is possible that Shakespeare and his father would have gone to see the happenings there at Kenilworth Castle, but obviously it wasn't necessarily a public performance. It was just for Elizabeth. So I don't know that they would have been able to go in. But of course, if you think about them shooting off fireworks and other spectacles that were recorded to have been there, you could have seen that from outside. So anyway, that one I think is a story that is fascinating to explore.
Well, he was definitely a very interesting character, and whether or not history is written by the winners, there's no doubt about that. And whether or not you believe that he was a serial poisoner or not is another aspect to him that I think is worth exploring. The mysterious deaths of women connected to him were another aspect of him and his history. He was probably, I know you said you're rooting for him, but I don't know that he was the best guy. And that's probably why she determined that he wasn't the best guy. I think she was afraid that he. I feel like she
100% she made the right decision for the country. I just feel like there's a lot of evidence to suggest she was in love with him, and probably I think he came closer than anyone else to getting her to agree to marry him. But it just shows her strength of focus. I think she was queen first and Elizabeth second.
There are a lot of people, Shakespeare authorship, mystery, and theory aside, There are a lot of people who believe that the Earl of Essex was actually Robert Dudley's son, and that possibly Elizabeth was his mother. Have you gone into any episodes where people have talked about whether or not Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, maybe had a secret child at some point in her life by one of these courtiers, specifically Robert Dudley?
I have actually covered that on a YouTube channel episode, just where I looked at, hey, this is a thing that people say. And we looked at some of the evidence there. I will not take sides. I will say that I could see where there's a question mark there for sure. There's definitely a mystery around, is that possible? The timing matches up, the motives match up, the situation is tantalizing in its portrayal of could that be what happened. So as far as possible, well, yeah, we can tell it's possible. I don't think we know one way or the other.
But you would admit then that your belief is that she obviously was not a virgin queen, and that she was having sexual relations with him, if not many others, during her time where she could have conceived a child.
No, you're misquoting me. What I'm saying is that I think it's possible. I'm saying that she's the queen, and she behaved suggestively with several gentlemen. Whether she had sex with them or not, I don't know that, and I don't think we have any evidence to know that. But I do think that she could have.
Okay, I see.
I do think
that's a better clarification.
I think she. Okay.
I mean, obviously we don't have a view into her bedroom or her bedchamber, so we don't know for a fact.
Right. I mean, she didn't
there.
Write a diary down to know for sure, but she came real close. I mean, I'll say that you read some of the evidence about what we do know, and you're like, oh, wow, this definitely the circumstantial evidence is there. Yeah.
Well, so certainly one thing that I think we will both agree about is that it is one of the most intriguing periods of history. The works of Shakespeare have contributed to that, and that golden era of the Elizabethan age would not be the same without those works and the existence of those works. I love that the title of your podcast is That Shakespeare Life, but it really covers so much of the lives of so many others that lived during the time period. And it's one of the reasons why I enjoy the podcast so much. And I learn so much with every episode about different people and aspects of society at the time that help enlighten me to the plays, which is most important to me because being a producer and director of Shakespeare, anything that helps me to share with the actors more insight into what it is that they're conveying through the characters is going to make it a more enjoyable performance for the audience. And so, you need to know about the author's time period, the things that are going on in history at the time, the same as you would study, the life of Tennessee Williams, for instance, if you were going to do Streetcar Named Desire. And so that's a giant part of it for me. And I appreciate that your series is available for me to dive into to find out some of those things, including the revelation today about the spit dogs. What were they called? Spit dogs? Not spit dogs.
Turn spit dogs. Yes.
Turn spit dogs. Yeah. And
yes.
Now I fully understand that reference better when Benedict makes it in Much Ado About Nothing. It's incredible.
There you go. So you'll enjoy that play just a little bit more.
I will. I always do. That happens to be one of my greatest favorites, by the way. I think Much Ado About Nothing is one of the most perfect plays ever written.
Anybody who can pull out direct quotes as fast as you did has explored that play more than a few times.
Yes, well, that's my specialty, I guess. But yeah, thank you so much. Cassidy, it's been a tremendous pleasure. I thank you so much for agreeing to come and speak with me for my listeners to hear and enjoy. Quiller Nation, you can find everything Cassidy Cash at CassidyCash.com. CassidyCash.com. That's spelled CassidyCash. H. Thank you again. It's been a wonderful experience, and I look forward to more of your content week after week.
I appreciate you having me. It was fun to share parts of my story, and I hope I shared some fun history with your listeners. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Before we wrap things up here today, I want to remind you once again to save the date, April 11th through the 14th, 2024, for our Quiller Nation event. Remember, send me an email if you want to be on our newsletter list to stay informed of important details. I promise we don't share our list with anyone, and you won't get any junk email from us. Just details about all things Quiller in nature. If you want to be added to the list, send me an email requesting to be added at contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Send it to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Also, look for our latest bonus feature, Much Ado About Edward de Vere, where I dive deep into the play to explain its connections to the life of Edward de Vere. I happen to be working on my 6th production of this magnificent play, and I do believe that Much Ado About Nothing is one of the most perfect plays ever written. I can't tell you how much you can glean from the text of a play by producing and directing it multiple times in your life. We've had guests here on the program who have talked about that very thing. And there's just something that working on a performance of the play can bring to you that merely reading it just doesn't do. It just can't. Especially when you consider that these works originated to be performed, to be watched by audiences, to be interpreted by actors and the directors who guide them. Every time I get something more out of the text through the choices the actors make and the evolution of the production through the rehearsal process. You can literally watch aspects of Edward's life come to life before your eyes as you're giving direction to the actors and explaining the basis for specific moments in the text, why they're funny, why they relate to the author's intent, what the purpose, what the barb, the jab, the lampooning of members of court, all of that subtext and underbelly comes to life through the actors' choices, especially once they're informed of all those details. And it's such a wonderful experience. And I share some of that with you in our latest bonus feature, Much Ado About Edward de Vere. Remember, you can access our bonus library, which continues to grow, by joining our Patreon list at the appropriate serial Quiller level. Just click the Patreon button on the homepage of our website or go to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. You'll find us there. Sign up today. And now, without further ado, here is producer Jake to announce our June Quiller of the Month.
Yes, Stephen, no more ado. It is I, producer Jake, here with the honor once again of spinning the wheel to see who is going to be our Quiller of the Month. If you're not sure what this is, well, every eligible patron over at patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger is entered into this monthly contest, of which the winner is awarded an item of their choosing from the shop. Brand new Don't Quill the Messenger hats available in the shop right now. And of course, you get the clout of just being the Quiller of the Month for the month. Like, you should just walk around with your head held a little high. Your posture should just be fixed. Like, it should really fix most of your problems being the Quiller of the Month. All right. Anyways, let's get on with it. I am going to spin the wheel of names, and the Quiller of the Month for the month of June is... it's sort of a cheat because it's two people. It's Brent Evans and Patty Henderson. Two people who both have one Patreon account. So Brent Evans and Patty Henderson, congrats on being the collective Quiller of the Month. You still are only going to get one thing. I just want to put that out there. I suppose if you get like a really big t-shirt, then like one half could go on one and the other can. I'll let you guys sort it out. Anyways, Brett Evans, Patty Henderson, thank you so much for your continued support of the program. Thanks to each and every one of the patrons. Without your support, we could not make this program as fantastic as it is. Once again, Brent and Patty, co-Quillers of the Month. There you go. Should have come up with that sooner. Thanks, everybody. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake, as always, and congratulations to our June winner. You can qualify to be in the running every month by signing up at our Patreon page and joining at the appropriate level. Just one more special thank you to our guest, Cassidy Cash. You can find her and her work at CassidyCash.com, CassidyCash.com. We mentioned in the episode her membership in the English Playing Cards Society, and then I completely forgot to ask her about it, which you all know I often can do. I will say to a guest, oh, we'll get back to that, and then completely forget to get back to that. And it happened again this time. But I have spoken with Cassidy offline, and she has agreed to return for a future episode to discuss that topic with us in more detail. So watch for that in the coming months. Thank you again, Cassidy. It was such a pleasure, and we look forward to having you back again in the future. In the meantime, fellow Quillers, thank you once again for joining us every fortnight to dive into this great literary mystery. And until we meet again, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.